Alright. Are reparations a form of justice? This has been a recent question with a not so clear answer. Some say that it's an obvious way to repay those who were wronged, but others hesitate in stating that payback is an acceptable form of justice. Today we're going to be looking at this question more in depth through the case of James. James is a citizen of Sophistopolis who is refusing to comply with the mandate of financial reparations to Volscians, who come from the community of Vols that was conquered by Sophistopolis over 500 years ago. During the conquest, the people of Vols resisted, and as a result, thousands of Volscian men and women were killed. Now, since then, Sophistopolis has since apologized for its crimes and even pushed to preserve the Volscian culture by creating a museum. But nonetheless, the question of if James should be prosecuted for refusing to comply still remains. And to do this, we're going to be taking the big question of are reparations a form of justice and breaking it down into two scenarios. One where we assume that it is morally correct, and one where we assume it is not. And then by going into each cases, I will be showing us and guiding us to the conclusion that James still should not be prosecuted, and he is justified in his actions, leaving us with the total straightforward decision that James should not be prosecuted. Now, starting off with the first case when we assume reparations are not morally correct. Well, then it's obvious that he shouldn't be prosecuted because the meaning behind the mandate is flawed. That law is missing its moral that it attempts to represent and needs to be revised. But nevertheless, one could still argue that the law was passed by the government and still should be followed. Well, we've seen that line of reasoning has not necessarily ended productively. For example, here in the US, segregation was once mandated by the government. You were compelled by law to actively discriminate against others, which now we see as entirely unjust and encourage people to do the opposite. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, a citizen has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to follow just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. This mandate, when we view reparations as being morally wrong, is a perfect example of a flawed law, of an unjust law, and therefore James should not be prosecuted. Now, what we've done here, even though we know that of course James should not be prosecuted when we view reparations as wrong, the important thing is we've articulated the reasoning behind why. It's important to stress the meaning behind these laws because these laws attempt to represent abstract moral principles. If we cannot coherently describe the meaning behind a law or policy, the article is flawed because we cannot describe what moral it attempts to represent, which is the exact flaw that I'm going to be showing in this next case when we assume reparations are morally correct. Now, before we get into this, let's start off with an example. We're all familiar with the tragic events that occurred in the 1940s inside of Germany when the Jewish people were not only persecuted, but the destruction of their culture was sought after. Now, thankfully, that did not occur, and consequently, in 1952, Germany aimed to show its remorse by repaying reparations to a sum of nearly $1 billion in today's currency to Israel. Now, this scenario makes perfect sense as Germany is providing and repaying the damages it had done to the Jewish culture to a specified set of people and a specified location. But when we compare our scenario to this, we quickly see a stark difference. When Vols was conquered by Sophistopolis, there was no relocation for the Volscians. There was no external place that the Volscians fled to, and rather, Vols was integrated and merged into Sophistopolis. So this begs the question of, who do we pay these reparations to? If there are no Volscians that remain today, who are we going to pay these reparations as the city of Vols was merged into Sophistopolis? The Sophistopolis today and the Vols today are nowhere near the same from 500 years ago. They have merged and become the true nation, just as we see in the United States compared to 200 years ago and how it is today. But overlooking the fact that we lose some of our meaning whenever we attempt to draft a system of reparations, when we see them as correct, we come across yet another issue of how do these reparations even be dealt out? What happens when somebody is an 8th or a 16th Volscian? Do they pay some of the tax but receive some as well? Do we kind of just nullify those that are mixed? Do they only pay a proportion of how much they are Sophistopolian? It doesn't make sense. And what about the actual Volscians who were the true victims? The Volscians that fled during the initial conquest, those are the only true victims in this scenario. So why aren't they getting any money? How can we say that James is being prejudiced against a system when we cannot even identify a system he is being prejudiced against? So we quickly see that even when we assume reparations are morally correct, there is no identifiable system we can attempt to draft to show that James should be prosecuted in any form whatsoever. So, taking a step back, let's see how we structured this argument. We took the big question of are reparations a form of justice, broke it down into two scenarios. We said one, let's assume it is, one, let's assume it's not. And we went into both scenarios and we saw that nevertheless, James is justified in his actions because of the fact that we cannot coherently describe the moral that reparations and having the mandated reparations attempts to represent. We are losing the meaning and we're losing the abstract moral concept it attempts to represent. As Martin Luther King Jr. would say, this is an example, this is a perfect example of unjust laws in our society. And as he said earlier, and as we quoted, unjust laws should be disobeyed, and that's a moral responsibility for a proper citizen. So, in conclusion, Sophistopoulos, if we look at it, is already doing what should be done, protecting and preserving the Volscian culture in creating a museum, because what lives through time are not the people of a civilization, but rather the traditions and stories that reveal who they are today. Thank you.